Given that male-male and male-female relationships in ancient Greece were shaped by very different norms than those we hold today, it's important to understand how these dynamics were perceived by Plato and Socrates when reading Lysis. Admittedly, the interactions in Plato's dialogues can seem unusual at first, and I felt that same strangeness upon my first reading. But it's crucial to remember that Plato was writing within the framework of his own cultural world. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth, and Plato's work attempts to reverse this charge, presenting him instead as someone genuinely concerned with guiding the young toward virtue and wisdom. With that in mind, let's briefly examine the social attitudes of classical Athens to better grasp the dialogue's background. The modern idea of homosexuality isn't very useful here. What we understand today as a sexual identity, shaped by psychoanalysis, modern psychology, and industrial age values, simply didn't exist then. In our culture, sexual orientation is often viewed as a defining personal trait. In contrast, the Greeks didn't organize relationships around fixed identities. In classical Athens, it was common for men to marry women and have families, but it was also fairly typical for them to form intimate relationships with younger males, sometimes with deeper emotional or intellectual connections. However, even bisexuality doesn't capture this accurately, since that term suggests a spectrum of preference not present in ancient Greek thinking. It's more precise to say that many men engaged sexually with both sexes, with varying personal leanings. Among the elite and intellectuals, the circles Plato knew best, male-male bonds were often more prominent and more idealized. Such relationships were usually structured between an older man, the lover, and a younger boy, the beloved. The older male pursued and guided the younger, often acting as a mentor and protector. These boys were typically in early adolescence, before growing facial hair, and received in exchange the older man's favor and instruction. The lover was often already married to a woman, and while most such pairings were temporary, a few lasting partnerships, like that of Agathon and Pausanias, were known. Though many men still favored women as spouses or sexual partners, relationships between men were celebrated in part because they centered around shared male pursuits. Athletics, rhetoric, war, and philosophy, all considered the highest expressions of virtue. Since women were mostly excluded from these public spheres, men found more intellectual and emotional companionship in other men. Marriage was primarily a civic duty aimed at continuing the family line, whereas same-sex love was often considered nobler due to its lack of material concerns. In the case of Lysis, a deep familiarity with all these social practices isn't essential, but it does help to understand how relationships between older and younger males were framed in Athenian society. The dialogue in Lysis begins as Socrates is walking from the academy straight to the Lyceum. Near the city gates, by the fountain of Panops, he encounters two young men, Hippothales and Ctesippus, whom he does not recognize. When they inquire about his destination, Socrates repeats that he is heading from the academy straight to the Lyceum. However, the young men have other plans and invite him instead to visit a recently opened palestra nearby, where, they assure him, a fine gathering of people awaits. Socrates immediately wants to know whether there are any wise teachers present, and they inform him that Miccus, an old friend and admirer of Socrates, is currently there. Socrates agrees to join them, but first seeks clarification on 2 points: what exactly is expected of him, and who among those gathered is considered the favorite, meaning the most beautiful. Hippothales avoids answering the first question and gives a vague response to the second, saying that opinions differ. Socrates quickly picks up on this uncertainty and presses Hippothales to name his favorite. In response, Hippothales turns red, which Socrates takes as clear evidence that he is indeed in love. Ctesippus remarks on the incongruity of Hippothales' bashfulness in front of Socrates, especially considering how frequently and loudly he professes his love for Lysis to their circle of friends, often with such terrible verse and delivery that he nearly drives them mad. It's strange, then, that in this moment he is unwilling even to utter Lysis' name. Socrates inquires further into who Lysis is, and learns that he is the young son of Democritus, a man of local prominence. Now that Socrates understands the identity of the boy Hippothales loves, he notes that his friend has chosen a noble object for his affection. He then asks to hear some of the love poetry Hippothales has supposedly inflicted upon his companions. Hippothales denies having composed or performed such verses, but Ctesippus firmly insists otherwise. Rather than push for the poems themselves, Socrates instead asks for a description of how Hippothales tries to express his love to Lysis. Hippothales responds by suggesting that if what Ctesippus says is true, then he should be able to explain the whole situation himself. Ctesippus launches into a sharp, humorous description of the sentimental verses Hippothales has been subjecting his companions to, songs and speeches all centered on Lysis. Most of these compositions, he says, revolve around tales of Lysis's ancestry, his family's athletic triumphs, the wealth of his father Democritus, and even a distant relation to Hercules. Ctesippus dismisses all of it as little more than old wives' tales. Socrates then turns to Hippothales and accuses him of crafting these elaborate praises not for Lysis himself, but as a way of celebrating what he sees as his own romantic conquest, as though he had already succeeded in winning Lysis's affection. Socrates criticizes him for this, pointing out that by glorifying Lysis so extravagantly, Hippothales is effectively boasting about a love he has not yet secured. Hippothales protests, insisting that the poems are meant to honor Lysis, not himself. But Socrates clarifies that in elevating Lysis so highly, Hippothales is actually glorifying himself as the future possessor of that prized love. This, Socrates warns, is a dangerous move, because if Hippothales fails, his loss will be all the more embarrassing, having made such a public display. Socrates also adds a second criticism. Overly exalting the beloved tends to inflate their pride, making them more arrogant and less attainable. In trying to draw Lysis closer, Hippothales may be pushing him further away. Socrates even challenges the merit of Hippothales' work, remarking, "Surely, you wouldn't call someone a good poet whose verses do him harm." Realizing the point, Hippothales asks Socrates for advice on how he should go about pursuing Lysis. Socrates responds that it's difficult to offer guidance without first meeting the boy. The group then agrees to head inside, where the festival of Hermes, the Hermia, is underway. At this event, there is no formal divide between the adults and the youths, so it is likely that Lysis is present. And if he is not, Ctesippus assures them that one of Lysis's close companions will be able to bring him. Once inside, the group finds that the boys have just completed the sacrificial rites and are now playing dice in the apoditorium, the room where they undress. Lysis isn't participating, but stands nearby, observing the game. The men take seats across the room, catching Lysis's attention, though he doesn't approach them until his companion Menexenus joins. Meanwhile, Hippothales stays out of sight, avoiding Lysis's notice so as not to irritate him with his constant presence. Socrates starts things off with a few playful questions, trying to determine which of the two boys, Lysis or Menexenus, is older and which is more distinguished, topics that apparently stir some debate between them. When Socrates then asks who is the more handsome, the boys simply laugh. Just then, Menexenus is called away to wrap up the sacrificial duties, giving Socrates the chance to speak with Lysis alone. At this point, the dialogue shifts into an elenchus, with Socrates leading Lysis through a series of probing, sometimes misleading questions. He begins exploring whether Lysis's parents treat him like a free person or more like a servant. Socrates suggests, while feigning surprise, that Lysis seems to be treated more like a slave. After all, he isn't allowed to handle the horses or even drive a simple cart, while the household slaves are. Even Lysis's supervisor, his tutor, is himself a slave. But Lysis is not disturbed by this line of argument. On the contrary, he laughs at how bizarre yet logically tight Socrates' reasoning appears. He eventually explains that his parents limit him because he hasn't yet reached adulthood. Socrates responds by pointing out that Lysis is already trusted with serious tasks, reading and writing for the family, tuning musical instruments, despite his age. Lysis then proposes that the restriction is due not to his age, but to his level of understanding. For example, he knows how to read and play the lyre, but not how to drive a chariot. Socrates eagerly seizes on this, stating, "Yes, my dear boy, it's not about years, but about knowledge." Building on this, Socrates asks Lysis to imagine that if he were wise enough, not only his parents, but even the broader society, neighbors, the people of Athens, and even the Persian king, would entrust things to him. If Lysis had superior knowledge of household management, his neighbor would turn over his affairs to him. Likewise, the Athenian citizens would entrust their matters to him. The Persian monarch himself would prefer Lysis to cook for him if Lysis were the better cook, and would even allow Lysis to tend to the prince's eyesight if he were the more capable healer. The message is clear. All people, Greeks and non-Greeks, men and women alike, will give control to those who truly understand, because true knowledge lets us make good use of things. Conversely, in matters where we lack skill, even our closest companions will get in our way. In fact, if we are completely ignorant, we cannot expect love or friendship, not even from our own parents, since we are of no benefit to them. Lysis affirms all these points. Socrates then brings the argument to a close by saying that Lysis clearly lacks wisdom, as he still needs someone to teach him. Without wisdom, Socrates says, Lysis cannot think lofty thoughts or feel proud. Lysis accepts this as well. At that moment, Socrates is tempted to call out to Hippothales and urge him to observe how instead of flattering Lysis and turning him into a proud, untouchable beloved, he has managed to humble him, making him aware of his need for guidance. But noticing that Hippothales is already listening from the shadows, overwhelmed and flustered, Socrates quietly lets him remain where he is. When Menexenus returns from completing his tasks, he takes his seat again beside the group. Lysis quietly leans over to Socrates and, with youthful affection, asks him to repeat to Menexenus the ideas they had just discussed. Socrates gently suggests that Lysis should tell Menexenus himself. Lysis agrees, but says he'll explain it later. For now, he simply wants Socrates to engage Menexenus in discussion. He describes Menexenus as argumentative and in need of being put in his place. At that point, Ctesippus notices the whispering and interrupts, prompting Socrates to begin his conversation with Menexenus. Socrates starts by offering a long reflection on friendship, saying he values a true friend more than any possessions, whether horses, hunting dogs, or all the treasures of Persia. He expresses admiration for the deep bond between Lysis and Menexenus, noting that such close friendships are rare at such a young age. He's so struck by their connection, he says, that he feels confused about how friendship even comes about, and would like to ask for their insight. Socrates begins with a key question. In a friendship, is it the one who loves or the one who is loved who is truly the friend? Menexenus answers that it could be either. But Socrates challenges this. Love is not always mutual. Sometimes it is unreciprocated or even met with hostility. So, he argues, a person cannot truly be considered a friend if their affection is not returned. Next, Socrates observes that certain beings, like horses, or sometimes even children, do not necessarily return affection to those who love them. This might suggest they cannot be loved, but that doesn't seem right either. It appears, then, that someone can still love another even without being loved in return, and that the same could apply in cases of hatred. But this leads to a troubling implication. If love and hatred don't require reciprocity, then it must be possible for someone to love their enemy and hate their friend. This conclusion feels absurd. Something must be off. And so, the discussion reaches a moment of confusion. If neither the lover nor the beloved can consistently be called a friend, then who, truly, are friends to one another? Socrates turns to Menexenus and wonders aloud if perhaps they have gone completely astray in their reasoning, given the dead end they've just reached. At that moment, Lysis interjects, insisting that they must indeed have gone wrong, only to suddenly go red with embarrassment for having spoken out so boldly. Socrates smiles at this, noting how attentively Lysis has been following the discussion. Encouraged by the boy's interest, Socrates decides to pause the conversation with Menexenus and return to speaking with Lysis. He begins by agreeing with Lysis that their earlier reasoning must have faltered somewhere, and proposes they seek guidance from the poets, whom he calls the founders and pioneers of wisdom. Socrates recalls that these poets claim it is a divine force that brings friends together, quoting a verse that says, "God is constantly drawing like, toward like, and joining them in friendship." Likewise, the natural philosophers, those who spend their time discussing the workings of the world, also claim that like is attracted to like. Socrates notes, however, that this idea seems flawed when applied to bad people, who are often no less hostile toward one another than toward anyone else. He speculates that this may be because such individuals are in conflict even with themselves, and therefore incapable of harmony with others. If so, then perhaps what the saying really means is that only the good can be true friends, and the wicked are friends with no one, not even each other. This leads to a tentative conclusion. True friendship exists only among the good. Yet Socrates is not quite convinced by this either. He begins to question the idea further, pointing out that if two people are truly alike, both good, say, then neither could harm or help the other without being equally capable of doing the same to himself. But if neither needs anything from the other, then what benefit or affection can arise between them? Without mutual benefit or desire, love, and therefore friendship, seems impossible. Socrates wonders aloud whether friendship might not arise from simple similarity, but rather from being similar in goodness, that one good person may befriend another to the extent that both share virtue. Yet even here, a difficulty remains. The truly good person, precisely because of his goodness, is self-sufficient. Lacking need, he lacks desire, and where there is no desire, there can be no love or friendship. At this, Socrates suggests that once again they may be entirely mistaken in their assumptions. He turns now to Hesiod, quoting passages that seem to suggest the opposite of the earlier claim, that friendship might be rooted not in likeness but in difference. According to Hesiod, those who are most alike are most prone to envy, conflict, and hatred, and the natural order seems to confirm this. Dry seeks wet, cold seeks heat, each thing drawn to its opposite. Menexenus eagerly rejoins the discussion at this point, supporting this new idea that the strongest friendships might arise between opposites. But this theory quickly collapses under scrutiny as well. It seems absurd, even offensive, to suggest that the just person could befriend the unjust, or that the good would find companionship in the bad. With that possibility dismissed, Socrates concludes that neither sameness nor opposition can explain the nature of friendship. Socrates offers a fresh idea to Menexenus. Perhaps the one who is truly a friend of the good is not the good man himself, nor the bad one, but something that lies between, something that is neither good nor bad. This suggestion leaves Menexenus confused, and Socrates admits that his mind is spinning from overthinking. He reflects that beauty, elusive and alluring, which quietly takes hold of our souls, is what the proverb calls a friend. Since the good and the beautiful are one and the same, Socrates believes this offers a clue. He goes on to argue that what lies between good and evil naturally seeks out and befriends what is good and beautiful. Drawing on the idea that reality consists of three basic kinds, good, bad, and neutral, Socrates points out that the good cannot befriend the good or the bad, and that the bad is incapable of being anyone's friend. If likeness doesn't lead to friendship either, then the only option left is that the neutral seeks friendship with the good. To back this up, Socrates brings in an analogy from medicine. A person who is ill longs for health, and thus is naturally inclined toward medicine, which is good. The sick body is not evil in itself, but has evil, illness, within it, making it a neutral thing affected by a negative force. To clarify how a neutral thing can carry evil without being evil itself, Socrates uses the example of color. A pigment might be applied to something, like Menexenus's reddish hair, without altering the true nature of what's underneath. However, There are cases when the evil does sink in and take over, and when that happens, the neutral no longer seeks the good as a friend. So, Socrates concludes, the good becomes a friend to the neutral so long as the neutral is affected by evil but not yet ruined by it. Based on this idea, he explains that neither the wise, who already possess knowledge, nor the self-deceived, who wrongly think they know, are true lovers of wisdom. Rather, love of wisdom belongs to those who are unknowingly ignorant. They lack knowledge but don't falsely believe they possess it. These individuals, being neither wholly good nor evil, are drawn to the good that is wisdom. Hence, even the good do not love other good, and the bad are no more capable of such love. Having reached this point, Socrates declares to the boys that they have successfully uncovered the essence of friendship. For a brief moment, he feels triumphant, like a hunter who has caught his prey. But soon after, a strange sense of doubt creeps in, and he begins to suspect something might be wrong with the entire line of reasoning. Socrates confesses this unease to the boys, and now he casts doubt on their recent conclusion, calling it merely a shadow. Menexenus, who continues the dialogue, asks why he thinks so. Socrates admits again to his concern that the argument may be misleading. Arguments, like people, he says, can sometimes be deceptive and aggressive. Socrates proposes that in every friendship there must be both a reason why someone becomes a friend and an object for which that friendship exists. He then poses a question. Is the thing that makes someone dear to us something we actually value, or something we detest? This puzzles Menexenus, so Socrates tries another route. He revisits the earlier analogy. The ill person is a friend to the doctor because of the illness, which is bad, and for the sake of regaining health, which is good. Since they have already agreed that the body itself is neither good nor bad, it follows that the body becomes a friend to medicine for two reasons. It seeks something good, health, and it suffers from something bad, disease. Still, Socrates is uneasy with this reasoning and examines it from another angle. If, he says, we value medicine because it brings health, and health because it brings something else, and so on endlessly, then there must exist some foundational thing that is loved for its own sake, a starting point for all valuing. He gives two examples. A father who prizes a bottle of wine because it can save his son from poison, and a man who treasures gold only as a means to another end. Neither the wine nor the gold is what they truly love. They are simply steps toward what really matters. In the same way, if something is cherished only because it leads to something else, then it cannot be what is truly dear. This applies equally to friendship. If friendship is to be considered truly dear, it must be something that is loved in itself, not as a means to another end. In that case, Socrates reasons, the good is what is truly a friend. But here lies the problem. As he's already argued, goodness by itself has no role unless there's evil to contrast it. So if good is only desired because of evil, then it would seem that friendships based on utility would endure even after evil is gone, while those rooted in pure goodness would disappear. That, however, cannot be right. Socrates turns to the example of hunger. Hunger, he says, can be harmful or helpful. It may be either bad or good. So if evil were eliminated, hunger wouldn't vanish. It would simply become neutral or even beneficial. Therefore, even when evil is removed, desires, which are not themselves evil, continue to exist. And because of this, so too do love and friendship. If we accept this logic, Socrates concludes, then we must reject the idea that evil is what causes or motivates friendship. Now that evil has been dismissed as the explanation for why the neutral is drawn to the good, Socrates proposes that there must be some other source of friendship. The first candidate he puts forward is desire. What desires is drawn to what is desired at the moment of desire? Combining this with a prior conclusion that we only desire what we lack, Socrates deduces that friendship arises among those who are naturally or harmoniously fitting. That is, genuine friends are not identical, but complementary. Either in soul, character, habits, or appearance, each is drawn to what is missing in himself and present in the other. Menexenus eagerly agrees, saying, "Yes, yes. while Lysis remains quiet. Meanwhile, Hippothales silently beams with joy, clearly thrilled by the idea that true affection belongs only to those who are naturally matched, not those who merely pretend to love. For this idea to hold, however, Socrates must separate the notion of the congenial from the similar, since it's already been shown that like does not desire like. He admits that, carried away by the momentum of reasoning, we might be tempted to let this distinction stand for now. But an old difficulty still lingers. If the good is suited to the good, and the bad to the bad, we're left with the claim that the bad befriends the bad and the good, putting us right back where we started, facing the same contradiction that like cannot truly befriend like. At this point, Socrates seems genuinely at a loss. All he can do now, he says, is recite the arguments like a lawyer summing up a case. None of the options explored, the desired, the one who desires, the similar, the dissimilar, the virtuous, or the naturally suited, appears to offer a solid answer. Just as he's about to seek help from someone older, Lysis's and Menexenus's tutors suddenly show up, interrupting the dialogue like an evil omen. To Socrates, they seem agitated and half-drunk, bellowing in what he calls their foreign tongue. Despite some initial protest, the boys are eventually taken away. As they part, Socrates calls after them with a wry farewell, lamenting that the onlookers didn't simply let them be. "What a comedy this is," he says. "You two boys, and I, an old boy who wishes he were one of you, have spent all this time together, pretending to be friends, yet we still don't know what a friend really is.